Hello, and welcome to the Orthodontic Products Podcast. I'm your host, Allison Warner. For orthodontists looking for ways to reduce variability, streamline clinical workflows, and create more predictable treatment from bonding through finishing, passive self-ligating systems offer a solution. In this episode, sponsored by Dynaflex, we explore why some clinicians are moving toward passive self-ligation, not as a magic bracket, but as part of a broader, systemized approach to treatment planning, execution, and efficiency. Joining me to talk about this is Dr. Jason Sherbel, a board-certified orthodontist practicing in Southeast Michigan, who shares how adopting a passive self-ligating philosophy has helped his growing startup practice standardize mechanics, empower his team, and support a technology-driven approach to care. Here's our conversation. Dr. Sherbel, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. Okay, so to start us off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your practice and how long you've been practicing?
Yeah, so I've been practicing for about 5 years. I actually practice with my wife. She's also an orthodontist. We actually started our practice right out of residency. So, a startup is probably something we can chat a lot more about and those
Yeah.
issues. But yeah, our practice has grown quite a bit in the last 5 years. And as that's happened, we've had to adapt kind of new systems and technologies to kind of help us with that. But overall, our practice, I would say, is mostly kids. For like our comprehensive, maybe like 60%, 70% kids, 30% adults. Um, for and about I would say a third of our practice is actually phase ones in general. I also I completed a mini residency at University of Michigan in dental sleep medicine, and so
Okay.
I've been learning a lot more about airway.
Yeah.
And as I've been learning more and educating myself, I've been getting a lot more referrals from things like some ENTs to help with kids for not really dental reasons, but for some medical reasons, like with breathing and airway, like kids who've already had a tonsillectomy and are still having breathing issues. And so my practice just kind of recently has been also becoming a little bit more focused on sleep and airway, and
Okay.
so that's been a fun journey too.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you started to talk a little bit there about the type of cases and that you're predominantly seeing kids, but I just wonder, can you describe your kind of overall clinical philosophy when it comes to treatment planning and mechanics?
Yeah, so for one, I would say that I think when you're treatment planning a case, a quality treatment plan is important, but also you need to also have uh, proper like execution, right? And so as I've gone through the years, I used to kind of treat every case in a super unique way, kind of making decisions on the fly for everyone, and uh, that worked really well in the beginning when I
Hmm.
had all the time in the world.
Ah.
And then as the practice grew and we were getting more patients, it became busier. I, realized I needed better systems in my practice to actually be able to get those clinical results. And so lately, I've been trying to leverage a lot more technology to kind of help us with that. And so we've switched to more passive self-ligating brackets. We incorporated digital indirect bonding. And we've even have a CBCT now, like a cone beam, so that we can actually integrate the roots and whatnot with indirect
Yeah.
bondings, replacing
Okay.
brackets
Yeah.
a little bit more accurately. I can actually see the root while I'm placing the bracket on the computer, and that's helped us be able to, I guess, grow more responsibly, where we can grow, but care isn't being uh, diminished or an afterthought. It's actually we've actually been able to get better results with that.
Okay. So let's dive into our topic. And you brought it up a little bit there is the passive self-ligating systems. So what originally got you thinking about moving toward a passive self-ligation system? And what problems were you hoping it would solve in your practice?
Yeah, so um, when I was in residency, I was exposed to several different bracket systems, right, and treatment philosophies, and it gave me the opportunity to see firsthand the strengths and weaknesses between these different systems. But my biggest takeaway was simple that there is no magic bracket, right? Good orthodontics comes from thoughtful treatment planning and careful execution. Now, that being said, the bracket system you choose can absolutely help solve specific problems in your
Mhm.
practice, right? And so, like I had mentioned, when Mary and I started our practice right out of residency, early on, we had all that time in the world. If a patient if a read long, it didn't matter. If a patient needed repositioning, no problem. There's no one waiting in the waiting room, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But as our practice grew, and it grew rather quickly, these
Mhm.
inconsistencies in the way that we practice started to compound. And so appointments ran longer than expected. Patients were waiting in the waiting room a little bit longer. Total treatment times were stretching beyond what we had projected, and we kind of knew something had to change. And so when we stepped back and analyzed the practice, we didn't find actually like one single big problem, right?
Mhm.
We found dozens of small inefficiencies,
Okay.
right? And individually, they were very minor, right?
Mhm.
But collectively, they were affecting our workflow,
Yeah.
our energy, and ultimately our results. And
Mhm.
so that's when we knew something had to change. And that's what got me thinking more about passive self ligation. Um, I was more of chasing more of like consistency.
So, can you talk to me about the inefficiencies you kind of identified and what you were hoping to attack with a new system?
Yeah. So, okay. Sometimes a patient would come in for their first visit after bonding, and maybe one or two teeth were still rotated. We all kind of experienced that.
Mhm.
They were properly figure eight tied, but the elastomerics, loosened over time. So when the patient came in for their visit, the wire was no longer, fully engaged.
Mhm.
And so instead of progressing to the next wire, you might just retie, stay in that initial wire for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And if you're seeing the patient every 8 to 10 weeks, you've now just effectively added 8 to 10 weeks to their treatment, right?
Mhm.
And so, now steel ties can reduce that issue, but they also introduce another variable, right? They're very technique sensitive. And so not every assistant ties the same way. And so not every tie is equally tight, right?
Mhm.
I can't tell you how many times a patient would come back with a steel tie that maybe wasn't quite tight enough to fully engage the wire to the back of the bracket, right? Now, was it the assistant? Did the assistant not tie it tight enough? Or
Mhm.
did it start to loosen or untwist over time between
Right.
appointments? We may never know, but either way, that's an inefficiency,
Yeah.
right? And so what I appreciate about passive self-lagging brackets is that when the door is closed, right, that wire is engaged as fully as that system allows.
Mhm.
And it removes any assistant dependent variability.
Mm.
Once the door is closed, there's no slack of that door over time, right?
Mhm.
And so as our practice scaled, that kind of consistency mattered more and more.
Mhm.
Um, and once that was kind of, I guess, taken care of, that now led into better archwire progression, right? So with conventional ligation, part of every visit involved checking, are the teeth fully tied in? Is this patient
Mhm.
actually ready for the next wire, right?
Mhm.
That takes a provider's time, but it also adds another level of decision making. And usually the provider's time is the bottleneck in the practice. I know it is for ours.
Mhm.
And so with passive self-ligation, if the doors are closed and your archwire sequence is standardized, assistants can now confidently begin progressing patients to the next wire before I even sit down, right?
Ah.
Your
Mhm.
assistants now have this autonomy. It empowers your team, right? It improves your practice flow, and it does this without compromising care. Because if something is more efficient but compromises on care,
Mhm.
that's not a good trade-off, right? That's a
Yeah.
non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And so once that was standardized, right? Now we can start talking about repositioning appointments. We realized our repositioning appointments were very inconsistent. Some
Okay.
patients were repositioned at visit 3, other at visit 8, right? It
Mm.
depended more on how things were progressing than on any true system. And so once we standardized our wire sequence, now that changed. Now patients are in predictable wires at predictable visits, right? Which
Mhm.
made repositioning timing much more consistent and predictable. You know, I know when a repositioning is coming, and now our
Mhm.
team knows when a repositioning is
Mm.
coming, right? There's
Yeah.
less reacting and decision making and more just planning and flow, right? And that kind of systemization really kind of reduces friction across the
Yeah.
entire office, right?
Yeah.
Um, and another element that I don't think I ever really hear people talk about is decision fatigue. Okay.
Mm. Okay.
Um, you know, as orthodontists, we see dozens of patients a day, and every
Mhm.
single one requires a decision or multiple decisions, right? Wire progression, mechanics, elastics, repositioning, anchorage considerations, right? you know, I grew up playing a lot of chess, and I always think about, like, those grandmasters who would play, like, 10 boards at once. Like, they would move from table to table. They'd, like, analyze the position, make a strategic decision, then move on to the next board, and that's what I feel like we do as orthodontists all day, right? Except instead of chess pieces and chessboards, it's, like, with teeth and occlusion, right? And by the end of the day, decision fatigue is real. Like, my brain feels like mush almost. And so when I reduce the variability in ligation and sequencing and repositioning, I also reduce the number of micro decisions I have to make, right?
Mhm.
And that mental clarity alone, I think, has value, right? It's not just the inner peace it gives you, but also like the bandwidth to make better decision on other things that need your attention. So, yeah, I don't think passive self-lighting brackets are magic, but they definitely solve a lot of certain issues in my practice.
So, can you talk to me about what you were looking for when you were evaluating different PSL options and what stood out to you about the NORA system and why did you feel like this was the right fit for your treatment philosophy?
So, good question. So, when I decided to explore self-ligating brackets, I quickly realized there were a lot of options,
Mhm.
and each bracket has their own strong claims on why theirs is the best, right? But as I said many times, there is no magic bracket, and so. But what really stood out to me about the Norris system is that the bracket was an O2O slot. Okay. In residency, I've treated cases with both 018 slot, 022 systems. I heard arguments from different professors for why they preferred one over the other, and both sides have valid points, right? So the advantage of an 018 slot is earlier slot fill. So you fill the slot sooner, which means earlier torque expression, less play or slop between the wires in the bracket. And that tighter, wire slot relationship can translate into more precise control earlier on in treatment, right? Now, the trade-off is that you're limited the size of wires you can use. If you're probably finishing, if you're in an 018 slot, you're probably finishing in like a 1622, right? Rather than an 1825 or a 1925. And that makes certain mechanics, like let's say leveling a curve of speed, more dependent on adding like a reverse curve or other compensatory bends to get the job done, right? Now, on the other hand, proponents of 022 argue that the additional slot size allows you to progress to heavier working wires like a 1925, which can provide more, control in certain mechanics like
Mhm.
leveling curve of speed. But the trade-off there is there's more play earlier on in treatment with the torque expression not being utilized really at all till later in treatment. So even in residency, I asked myself and my professors and classmates,
Mhm.
what about an 020 slot, right?
Mhm. Okay.
If the advantage of an 018 is earlier engagement and reduced slop,
Mhm.
an 020 slot moves you closer to that precision, right, compared to an
Mhm.
022, but it still allows you to get to your 1925 wire. So
Mm.
for the vast majority of cases, that gives you the working dimensions you need without any of the additional play in an 022 system.
Yeah.
And so, I always like to make the counter argument point to make sure I'm being honest, right?
Mhm.
And so, you know, realistically, the strongest argument for an 022 then over an 020 would be for providers who want to use, let's say, a 21 by 25 wire, right?
Mhm.
Because that wouldn't fit in an 020.
Yeah.
But if you were to ask the reason why they're using a 2125, it would be to fill the slot to get more torque expression. And an 020 slot, you get that same expression now with a 1925,
Mhm.
right? So, at the time, I hadn't seen many mainstream O2O options. I think they were pretty much non-existent and essentially none in passive self-ligating for sure.
Yeah.
So I started with an O22 twin and loved it, right? But when I was evaluating passive self-ligating systems and saw that Norris offered an O20 slot,
Mhm.
that immediately aligned with like my mechanical
Ah,
philosophy and what I
okay.
was already gravitating toward.
Mhm.
And once I've committed to, I've been very happy with the decision and,
Mhm.
have gone all in.
Yeah. Talk to me about your onboarding of the system. Did you start with a few cases? Did you go all in? And what were those initial cases? And or what did you see in those initial cases? In terms of the efficiencies, how long till you saw those efficiencies?
So I
Yeah.
ended up just going all in.
Okay.
And, you know, I also kind of paired me going all in with the Norris bracket with also leveraging digital technologies like indirect bonding. And so, immediately, I saw better efficiencies at my practice, right? So, the brackets were being put on indirectly. Now, granted, that means I had a lot more homework. I was doing a lot of work on a computer. I still am. But I didn't necessarily need to be sitting at the chair the entire appointment now for the bracketing, right? I could come in at the end, check the brackets, make sure things are engaged, and now I can be doing other things like consultations or seeing other patients and making bends and wires for finishing. And so immediately, the bottleneck being me, the provider, I was like reduced in half. Like I had more time to do things. It wasn't people always waiting on me, right? Um, but the NOR system itself, what it allowed for was um, all of my assistants now were tying in the exact same way. The door was closed. Okay, it's tied in. And so
Mhm.
then that means we are going to be able to get to the next wire next time they come in. So now when the patient were to come in for the next visit, they're already grabbing the wires, they're untying, they're even maybe starting to tie in before I even sit down, right?
Mhm.
And so now that reduce the bottleneck even more. So
Yeah.
they don't have to wait for my go ahead for certain things. They kind of know what I'm going to say as long as the wire is going to fit. It'll work. The
Mhm.
only time that they wouldn't have to, do it is if they left the door open, right? And that would be a learning lesson saying, "Hey, look, the door was left open. Now that tooth didn't move. Now I have to stay in the same wire." But, those it immediately, uh, gave it so I had more of my time back.
Uh,
When I say time back, I don't mean, relaxing or or, it means more of my time to go be doing the other things that other people are
right.
waiting on me for,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so for orthodontists who are curious about a PSL system but haven't kind of taken that leap yet, what advice would you give based on what you've learned so far?
So, for me, passive self-ligation helps solve specific inefficiencies and problems that were affecting our practice flow, and which also meant it was affecting our results. It wasn't about chasing something new. It was about addressing like real variables that were compounding over time. And if you're using twin brackets and your systems are dialed in, your workflow is smooth, and you're not experiencing any of the inefficiencies I described, then maybe there isn't a reason for you to change, right? Twin brackets work. They're great. Orthodox been done for decades with them. But if you are starting to notice small inconsistencies, right? Variability in ligation, unpredictability in early treatment, challenges as your team grows with training and things like that, and you're looking for ways to reduce or eliminate those variables, right?
Mhm.
Passive self-ligation could be a very effective tool. It definitely was for me. It worked because it aligned with how I wanted to practice. And
Mhm.
with the right system in place, it would work for anyone. But don't just switch because you think it's like magic, right? It's not actually a shortcut.
Yeah.
It's a system.
Yeah.
And if you value reducing variables, simplifying team training, creating a more standardized workflow, passive self-ligation can absolutely support that.
Mm, okay. Well, before we finish up, I'm just curious. Can you talk about what excites you about the future of orthodontics or what do you have your eye on at this point?
Yeah, so, it's, quite recently, so once I started doing, like, indirect bonding, incorporating Norris and passive self-ligating, um, it kinda opened my eyes to just leveraging technology in general, right? And I had just mentioned with the CBCT, that's actually relatively new, we just got one, late last year, and, the sole reason was, well, I should say the sole reason, 2 of the reasons really were we wanted to evaluate better, like I said, there was a canine coming in, how it was affecting, was it resorbing a lateral, where it was, the position, instead of having to refer a patient out, for that CBCT, we can kinda take one in-house for them. But the real driving factor of why I wanted one was I realized after starting indirect bonding, there were options for me to actually see the actual roots of the teeth
Mhm.
while I'm placing the brackets on a computer.
Mm,
Before that, I thought that would have been like an impossibility. But
okay.
when orthodontists reposition, we're looking for things like where things aren't level, rotations, but also, we take a pan to evaluate the roots, right? And we see the root is tipped. Okay, we reposition the bracket to fix it.
Mhm.
But, what if that can be eliminated, And so I with the incorporation of like cone beam into with indirect bonding, I am able to actually place the bracket exactly along the long axis of the root now. I have an actual representation, right? And so instead of looking in the mouth and essentially guessing, right, or
Mhm.
looking at pan, which is distorted in its own right,
Mhm.
you can actually be more thorough at your initial bonding. And it makes me think as I get better and better at using this system,
Mhm.
can I eliminate the repositioning appointment in general, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so, I've it's really this whole passive self-ligating sparked like this interest in me of just like, okay, what else can I do to be more efficient in my practice. Now that I've seen the benefits, I'm just like,
Yeah.
I'm hungry for more. Like, how do we become more efficient? How do we become, how do can we reduce treatment times? It's better for not just the practice, but for our patients, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Dr. Sherbel, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your insights on this topic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. Yeah. Thanks again.
As always, thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Orthodontic Products Podcast to keep up with the latest episodes, and be sure to check out orthodonticproductsonline.com to keep up with the latest industry news. Until next time, take care.